Good afternoon and welcome to Ultima's final live webinar of 2020. What a year it has been and how grateful we are that it's almost over. My naam is Henry de Klerk van Ultima Financial Planners en ek is die MC vandag. And welcome joining us. You are welcome to send questions in the Q&A section on Teams. This can be found on the top right of your device or PC. On the top right hand side, you will see that there is a place, there's two speech bubbles, and you can click on there and then ask a question or two. We will have time at the end to answer your questions. So today we will be talking about estate planning, and our speaker is Mari Claassen. She's a certified financial planner professional. And Marie will help us through highlighting important areas to focus on when it comes to estate planning and your last will and testament. So we look forward to this session with Marie. I'm just going to share Marie's CV to introduce Marie to everyone. So Marie is a CFP qualified, but started a career as an attorney where she developed into a financial planning specialist. And she has 13 years of experience in this field. She joined Literatum Legal Services in 2017 as legal and fiduciary consultant, and her areas of expertise includes estate and trust planning, as well as tax planning. We've just before the session spoken about a lot of things about trusts and relevance and how they are working on trusts, which are spending a lot of time on. So it's quite interesting to spend time with her. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Marie for this webinar.
Thank you, Henry. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I thank Ultima for this joyous occasion. It's the last one of the year, but it seems that it is one that is actually very important, especially this week, as it's National Wills Week, which means that wills and estate planning is on everybody's mind. So yeah, today I'm going to have a discussion with you regarding estate planning, and what's interesting about it is that I think many people has a few conceptions or misconceptions, if I can rather put it that way, about estate planning and what it should be. But let's start at the very beginning, and the beginning should be, for me, let's look at what is estate planning from a definition point of view. So as always, we try to look at the academics, and this Professor Myrovich, he's actually a guru in our field, and he said that to define it in its simplest and basic terms, estate planning is the arrangement, management, securement, and disposition of a person's estate so that he, his family, and other beneficiaries can enjoy and continue to enjoy the maximum benefits from his worldly possessions during his lifetime and after his death. Now, typical professional, it's in my mind, it's a mouthful, and it's sort of intimidating in a certain sense. But if I think about estate planning, I think we can keep it quite simple. And for me, estate planning is nothing more than photography. And if we look at photography and we would say what makes for a good photograph, then I'm going to share with you two specific photographs, which you can judge for yourself which one is the better one. If we wanted to take a photograph, or I asked someone to take a photograph of a person standing amongst a few trees, then you might envision a certain picture in your mind. But the one option would be that you get a picture like this one. And Henry, if you can just indicate whether you can see it now clearly.
We can, thank you.
Fantastic, fantastic. So this one, if you look at this photograph, it's not really impressive. There is a few things. This is a person, and it's a person standing amongst the trees, but you can hardly see a face firstly, and then the proportions are sort of out of bounds. It's not specifically very clear as to what we want to achieve. But then the second one I want to share with you, if you look at this photograph, it's also a person standing amongst the trees. And you can see that this photograph was taken by someone who knows the principles of photography and how to best capture this specific moment. So if we then say that estate planning is just like photography, and there can be good photos and bad photos, how do we then say, how can we marry these two and get to a point where we can get the principles of photography to apply to estate planning? And then my question is, what if the basic photography principles could also be used to ensure a proper estate plan? So let me share a few principles with you. You might know them already if you're a photographer yourself. The first thing we want to do when we want to take a proper photograph is to position the horizon. Nothing worse than getting a horizon which is askew. It upsets every viewer of the photograph. But the first question for me from a estate planning point of view would be, what do I want to achieve? What do I want to have on my horizon? Why do I want to do this estate plan? Why do I want to put it together? And for me, putting an estate plan together, it is for the following reasons. Firstly, we want to make sufficient provision for ourselves and our dependents during our lifetime. So we want to look after ourselves and make sure that what we accumulate serves its purpose. Secondly, sufficient financial provision for the maintenance of my dependents during the winding up of my estate. Most of you know that if someone passes away, the estate is frozen, which means that the family has hardly any access to any funds. So the idea with the estate plan is to make sure that there's a type of a secret stash which the family has access to take care of them. Thirdly, we might also want to make sure in the estate plan that we have enough financial provision to take care of our family members even when we are not here anymore. We also want to make sure that the wishes we have in respect of our will, which states how our assets should be distributed amongst our beneficiaries, we want to make sure that it's practical and that it's definitely something that could be put in place and everybody receives what you wish for them to receive. We also want to make sure, as part of our estate plan, we want to achieve the following. We want to protect our assets in our estate against the possibility of a forced sale and make sure that there's sufficient liquidity in our estates. The last thing you would obviously want is that there's insufficient liquidity, which means that assets needs to be sold and your family might not have even a roof over their heads. We also want to make sure that we don't pay excessive executors' fees, that we structure our estates in such a way that we can reduce the fees as far as possible, not pay unnecessary capital gains tax or estate duty, and make provision for other sort of hidden fees like master's fees, funeral costs, and miscellaneous costs. But most importantly, what we want to achieve with the estate plan is that we want to make sure that it is adjustable. Things change. That's the only thing in life that's certain is change. And we want to make sure that this financial plan, this estate plan, is flexible enough to change as we and our circumstances change. The second principle, which I think is a good one in photography, is to hold it steady. Nothing worse than a blurred photograph, except if you planned it, but nothing worse. So the question for us from an estate planning point of view would be, what am I doing right? Well, being a client of Ultima Financial Planning, I'm sure that most of you listening to this today already has a legal will in place. The question is, but is this a legal document which is enforceable, which will serve its purpose? And for a will to be enforceable and to comply with all the legal requirements, we have to take the following into account. Firstly, a will should be in writing. Just expressing your wishes in a verbal way to anyone does not, unfortunately, constitute the will. It has to be in writing. Secondly, it was created by a person older than 16 years, which is sound of mind. So if you have perhaps an elderly relative who is suffering from an illness like dementia, for instance, or Alzheimer's disease, the question would be if that person is still of sound mind, understanding what he or she is stating in this will. The testator or the testatrix, the person drawing up this will, should sign this will on each and every page and also at the end of the will. Very important, because that's one of the requirements of the Wills Act. Then it also has to be signed in the presence of two competent witnesses. And those witnesses basically attest to the fact that you as the testator or the testatrix has signed this will. And then something which I find quite often is that most wills, or not most wills, but some wills are not dated, which makes it very difficult to understand when was this person's wishes recorded in the form of a written document like a will, and is it perhaps that there was a revocation clause in the will which revoked other wills, and then we're not sure whether this one should replace a previous one. So those elements are very important from a practical and a legal point of view to make sure that this will be enforceable to take care of your needs and express your wishes in a way that can benefit your beneficiaries. But also a will can appoint guardians for your minor children. You can express your wishes regarding that and make sure that your children are taken care of by people who you intended and who you had a discussion with regarding that. You also appoint an executor, the person who will handle your will and will manage the estate when you are not here, and then trustees to take care of the funds which you've left to your minor children or your family to look after them over the long term. Also, what I hope most of you are doing right is that you have a living will in place. A living will is a legal document, as we state there, which reflects your wishes as to what you would like to be the decision in the case where you are not in a medical state to take your own decisions or communicate what your wishes are. So let's say someone would be in a motor vehicle accident, for instance, and the person is in a coma for a period of time, with no legal prospects that this person will recover to the point where he or she will be able to take care of their personal circumstances or their personal assets and estates anymore. Then a living will be something which will express those wishes, that you might not be someone who would like to be kept alive artificially or with life support machines. It gives your family also the opportunity to take care of you in the sense that they don't have to make the difficult decisions. You've basically made it for them. It also communicates these wishes regarding these procedures, and if you would like to be an organ donor, for instance, you could indicate that. But it gives you peace of mind, which I think is something that all of us would like to have, and also our family members to have. The other day, I had a discussion with an advocate who, in his practice, handles quite a few appointments of a curator bonus appointments. And what he said to me is that it's interesting that many people are very concerned about what happens to their assets when they pass away, but they're not concerned about what happens to their assets if they can't take care of those assets while they are still in life. My example of someone who is in a coma, for instance, that person is still alive. His will or any other testamentary documents can't at that stage already indicate what his wishes are, but that person is not physically or mentally able to manage his or her own estate. And the question is, how many clients think of it as to what should I do, how should I manage or plan for this contingency if something like that should happen to me? And there's two ways, I think, in which we can do it. The first one is that you can communicate with your family members or even appoint one of them specifically or other person whom you trust, that you can give them a power of attorney to assist with your financial affairs if you are physically not present. For example, you might decide to go on an overseas holiday and there's certain assets or certain of your interest here that needs to be managed while you're absent, and a power of attorney is a perfect way to do that. It's also a perfect solution for a family member who's elderly and perhaps in a nursing home, who is not in a position to go to the bank, for instance, and manage that, or go to a different financial institution to manage certain of his or her financial affairs. And a power of attorney, appointing someone who can act on your behalf in those circumstances, I think is a brilliant idea. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depends on how you look at it, South Africa does not have what we call an enduring power of attorney. That means that when you grant someone a power of attorney, that person must always be able to come back to you, and you must give your stamp of approval as to the decisions this person made. An enduring power of attorney is a document which would, even if that person's mental capacity is not there anymore, will still enable the person who enjoys that power of attorney to continue managing the affairs. So in our in our jurisdiction, there's no such thing as an enduring power of attorney. And in the position where someone is mentally unable to manage his or her own affairs, you'll have to appoint a curator bonus to look after your affairs. A curator bonus curator is basically someone who takes care, and bonus means things. So I'm taking care of someone else's things. And what I think is a good idea is that you discuss with family members that if I am mentally unable to manage my own affairs, would you be willing to take care of my affairs and manage it as per my wishes, which I can communicate with you beforehand? And being part of an application like that now, sometimes it's something that happens quite sudden. You didn't expect it. Your family member is diagnosed with something like dementia, and you didn't discuss what should happen with your assets. And communicating about this beforehand and enabling your family members by providing them with information as to how you would wish your assets to be managed. This could make the process of appointing someone to look after your estate much easier should this unfortunate event happen to you. So I hope that you are doing this right already, and if not, it's perhaps something which I think you can consider. The next principle about photography, I think most of you know, is that you should put the sun behind you. Obviously, if you don't want to take a picture with the sun bright in front of you. And I think that sometimes in estate planning, we also get blinded by the sun. We put it in front of us, and we have all these misconceptions or perceptions regarding our estates and how it works. Some of these are mentioned here. And the first one I hear many a time is that estate planning is just for the wealthy. It's just for people with lots of money, which is a big misconception. Everybody out there has assets, and everybody out there has a situation where you would like to manage these assets to the best of your benefit and the best of your family's benefit. It's for everyone. It's not only for the wealthy. The second one is that some people say that I'm too young for estate planning. And Henry and I were just discussing before we started with the presentation that the best place to start with estate planning is actually when you're younger, that you can put all your structures in place, and that you from the start make sure that all your assets are in the correct positions, and that you put it in a structure which over the long term will still serve your purpose, and even better than putting all your assets into one entity, for instance, your own name. I put it in brackets, but I think most people also, I get it lots of time that people say, I'm too young to have a will, I'm too young to die. If anything, and I don't necessarily want to make a whole song and dance about the pandemic that we experienced this year, I think wills became much more important, and it also shows that unfortunately death does not discriminate. The pandemic showed us that young people and old people were all affected equally. And I think it's very important to make sure that you have a will to express your wishes and to make sure that the assets reach the people who you intended it to reach eventually. The third one, which I mentioned there, is that I think many people say that my spouse is informed about my financial affairs. And what I see with clients is that many spouses think that my husband has it or my wife has it. I don't have to worry about it. But I think it's very important to share this financial information with each other. Even if you're not doing a whole joint account or joint financial management, it's good to inform someone about your financial affairs to make sure that someone is informed enough to assist the executor should something happen with you. I also hear many a time that I'm married, so everything will just go to my spouse. So there's no need for me to have a will, for instance. And that's a big misconception. You might have heard that if someone would pass away without a will, the estate will devolve in terms of the Intestate Succession Act, with a whole lot of rules and specific distributions that needs to take place. So it basically takes away the right that you have to dispose of your assets freely as you would have liked to wish. And it also creates a lot of uncertainty because nobody is sure. There might be a family member who all of a sudden stands in line to benefit, but you never would have intended for that person to inherit from you in the first place. I also hear that my family will do the right thing. So people would say, I have it that a family member would say, I'm bequeathing these assets to my children, and I assume that they will do the right thing and look after their grandparents. Unfortunately, if one of the lessons we have learned in our practice is that family members don't always do the right thing. You might have the conception that you raised your children properly, and perhaps it's true. But sometimes once that money lands in their bank accounts, they forget about the opa and the oma, and then they're not doing the right thing as you suppose or you assumed that they would do. Another thing I think which people tend to have a misconception or a perception about is that there's sufficient liquidity in their estates, that they say, oh, I have lots of investments or I have lots of life cover, but they have no absolute idea as to what the amount of life cover is which they have in place. And they might think that there's sufficient capital or funds available, but they are misinformed regarding the amount of executors' fees payable, for instance, or the amount of estate duty or capital gains tax being due and payable. So it's, I think, something which is quite important to make sure that you have sufficient liquidity in the estate, and the best way to do that is to do a proper financial analysis. One which I also get frequently is that my will is properly executed, that people think all those requirements which I mentioned earlier, that they've signed on every dotted line, that there's enough or sufficient witnesses who signed the will and so forth, and that many a time is not the case. I've had many wills which was not dated, which was not signed by witnesses in the proper way, which basically meant that that will is unenforceable and puts the whole family and the estate plan at risk. So don't be the person who takes the photograph directly into the sun. Make sure that you address these misconceptions, these ones which I have mentioned, but also do a proper estate plan to eliminate those misconceptions. The next principle, which is a good one in photography, is that we want details. I like macro photography, so it's always fun for me to zoom in on a specific thing. But I think when we look at estate planning is that for the details, or what we usually say, the devil is in the details, or the devil is in the lack of details for that matter. And people are very misinformed as to what documents are required. It's usually a mad rush looking for documents in families when someone passed away. And I think it's a good idea if you would create a file for yourself, which includes at least these type of documents, which will enable yourself or your family members, if you are the one who passed away, and your executor to wind up your estate in a very proper and speedy way. Documents, and it sounds a bit tedious, but documents which we would need to wind up estate is the identity documents, the death certificates, bank statements, firearm licenses, vehicle registration certificates. These documents are very important to assist the executor to make sure that the estate, all the assets are firstly accumulated and then properly distributed in terms of the will. But then if we talk about information is power, we can also say that communication with your family and your heirs is extremely important. In the past, it was sort of a taboo subject that families never talked about wills. Why would we discuss the will? It's a very grim topic, and even in my family, my sister refused to discuss any of this. In my line of work, I see how important it is, and the reason why we want testators or testatrix to have a conversation with their heirs about their wills and their estates are the following. Sometimes you make bequests in your estate or in your will, which is disproportionate as to what the family would have thought. And I think it's always good to communicate your reasoning behind it. Why did you decide to bequeath this specific asset to this specific heir? And mostly it's important just to avoid a family mess. Most of you have a story, most probably, that where you've heard where a family member, a father or a mother passed away, and then the children had such a big fight with each other that the family basically dissolved. Anything that was remotely looking like family is non-existent after the parents pass away. So it's important to communicate with your family why you would bequeath certain assets as you did. It's also important to, and it sounds also ridiculous, but where to find your will. I've seen many families running around looking for wills and phoning all kinds of estate planners or advisors who were involved in the past to find a copy of the will. Make sure your family knows where it is, and it's perhaps a good idea to create the file where you add your will and all those documents which I mentioned earlier, so that it's easily accessible for your family and to make sure that they will be able to use it in future when needed. It's also important that you should communicate with them where to find assets or information regarding the assets. These days, many clients have other type of currencies like Bitcoin or those type of cryptocurrencies, and there's specific information related to those assets, which many a time is only linked to the person, him or herself. If that person passes away, the password basically passes away with them, which means that the family can never access those assets. So it's always a good idea to communicate with your family where your assets are, what type of assets you have, and also extra information regarding it. What I find sometimes is that family members, when they inherit something, they sort of at a loss as to what they should do with these assets. How should we manage it? How should we do it? I don't know what the person's intention with it was initially. And I like that testator or testatrix communicate with the family how they manage their affairs. This is our way of doing things. It's good that your family take note of your way of doing things so that they can then also take that vision further, especially in family businesses. The person that created that business from scratch, and he had an idea as to how it should be managed for the future and how he wanted to expand it. And if he didn't communicate that with his or her heirs, that vision might be lost, which also means that the business eventually will fail. So communicate that and communicate it with your children to say, this is our way of doing it. And then you will see that the legacy will prolong and that the family will enjoy the benefits of these assets for many generations to come. The next principle of photography, which I think is quite good, is that sometimes you have to get closer to take a proper photograph and sometimes you have to go further. And with estate planning, I see it as a short-term versus a long-term plan. Some estate planning flaws, some issues with your estate plan, we can easily address over the short term. For instance, if you have an estate plan, but you're not exactly sure as to how it should work, that's something which can be addressed by just basically making an appointment with your estate planner and going through the whole plan again, explaining what the intention with specific stipulations are. It's also a good idea to make sure that when we, over the short term, see that there's an issue with outdated beneficiaries. Perhaps you've had one child when you drafted the will, but then in the meantime you had one or two more. That's always a good idea to address that issue in the will by reviewing the plan and make sure that it's the short term and a quick solution to update the will and make sure everybody whom you intended to be part of this will is included. Sometimes we also see in a will that there's no residuary clause. Basically, it says, I bequeath my house to my son and my motor vehicle to my daughter, but it makes no mention about anything else that is left. And that's something which can also be very easily addressed by just revising the will and making sure that you say the residue of my estate should go to this specific person. Some people also neglect appointing guardians for their minor children or making sufficient liquidity, making provision for sufficient liquidity in their estates. And that's also something which can easily be addressed by, for instance, mentioning the guardians of the minor children in their will, or taking out life cover to make provision for that liquidity. Other plans or other issues in the estate plan that has to be addressed over long term, unfortunately, is that it is something that needs to be remedied over time. For instance, ownership imbalances. Many a time, and in some families, most of the assets are registered in the one spouse's name. All the assets, the property, the vehicles, the investments, everything is in one person's name, which could be addressed and shared between the spouses, which will mean that there's a proper distribution of assets which could reduce estate costs eventually. Undesirable ownerships can also be part of the issue, which can be addressed, but over the longer term. For instance, where an asset is registered in a specific entity, but you would prefer it being registered in a different entity for the purpose of tax or for the purpose of eventual continuity of this asset. Estate growth is also something which can be addressed over the longer term. If you have certain assets and you continue to accumulate all those assets in your personal name, those assets will eventually be subject to estate duty, executors' fees, all those estate costs. But you could, over the longer term, put in place a estate plan which will make sure that the estate growth transfers from your own personal name to, for instance, a trust or to a company, which could make the overall estate eventually much smaller, although you still have access to those assets, but it makes the estate smaller, which means that the estate costs, executors' fees, capital gains tax, estate duty, those type of fees are eventually lower. Sometimes it happens that someone is not insurable, which means that we cannot put in place a quick solution like life insurance to take care of the liquidity issue that there might be in the estate. And then the family would have to save up to make provision for that liquidity, and that could then also be something which can be addressed over the longer term. The next principle of photography is use proportion. Balance is key. And if you think back to those two photographs I showed you earlier, the second one was perfectly balanced, perfectly symmetrical in a certain sense, whereas the first one was not good at all. So in estate planning, it's always a balancing act. Sometimes you want to achieve certain things, but that wish of yours, although it might be enforceable or easy to put in place, it will have certain expenses or certain additional costs which you did not foresee. Having said that, it's also important to say that saving costs and taxes should not be your only consideration. It should not be the be-all and end-all of why I do an estate plan is to reduce those costs. There's other issues which I think we should also consider. The first one being, say, family composition. If the family is a blended type of family where there's a situation where we have my children, your children, our children, then it's important to make sure that you distribute the assets in a way that the family all benefit from it, but not only one specifically. It's also important, I think, to take into account the abilities and attributes of your heirs. In the farming community, we many a times see where a father would say, I bequeath my farms to all my children. And then you might have one child who is an excellent businessman and a terrible farmer, and you may have another son who is a perfect farmer and a terrible businessman, for example. And if you bequeath those assets to children who has no ability to farm, for instance, or does not have the business acumen that's needed to manage this business properly, then you basically failed your heirs in the sense that you made the distributions, although fair on paper, you basically put them in a very difficult position. Another example of this is that I had a family where the mother was the owner of a preschool, a preschool for small children, and she bequeathed the preschool to both her son and her daughter. Although her daughter was working with her in the preschool and was a qualified preschool teacher, the brother now also inherited part of that business, and he had absolutely no idea how to manage a preschool firstly and to work with children. So that's the type of thing I think it's important to look at your children and their abilities and their attributes and make sure that we bequeath the correct assets to the correct heir. The timing of distributions, I think, is also important. If you have two children and the one might be 30 years old and the other one 21, if I say I bequeath these assets to the children, but the one of age 21 has absolutely no clue how to work with money, while as the one of 30 might have much more experience, it might not be a good idea to distribute those assets to them at exactly the same time. The one might be prudent, but the other one might just squander the money. So it's important to time when you think the person would be able to manage these assets properly. It's also important to say that if you are worried that your children might marry someone who is not proficient in managing his or her own affairs from a financial point of view, you might want to protect the assets you've bequeathed to your children against creditors or against divorce, and then put certain structures in place to make sure that it protects them and these assets. And then you would also don't want to bequeath assets to your children which can have a negative tax implication. You can put it in a specific structure which over the longer term could have better tax benefits for them than, for instance, just bequeathing it to them in person. The next one, I think, which is also a good photography principle and estate planning principle, is to consider the format and variety. One solution does not fit all. I'm going to jump ahead and first use the example about minor children versus major children. Major children are perhaps in a position to take care of themselves and manage their own affairs, but minor children obviously aren't. And minor children, having no capacity to act, they are not in a position to take care of their own financial matters. So when you bequeath assets or funds to your children in a will, you might have different rules for major children or minor children. You might also say that I bequeath these assets to a specific person, not taking into consideration that that person might predecease you, which means that you intended a specific heir, but that heir might not be in life anymore. So it's always a good idea to plan for succession and say, if my child, for instance, could not inherit anymore, his or her children will then be able to represent them. Some heirs are not capable of managing their own affairs. That means that an heir has a mental incapacity or has an issue with managing funds, for instance. That's also a good idea for specific heirs, you can make specific solutions. Then also keep in mind that there's a presumption that you always want to benefit all your children equally. And if you did not intend that to be, you must make provision for collation in your will, which says that if you've made certain dispositions to your son or your daughter during your lifetime, they don't have to include it it should not be considered as part of their inheritance, or it should be. And the best example of collation which we can find is actually the story of the prodigal son in the Bible, where the one actually got his inheritance before and squandered it, and then eventually the other son was very upset about it. So make sure that if you want to benefit your children equally, that if you've benefited them before, that there's a specific provision in your will to make sure that this is taken into account. We're almost there. The last two things, which I think is very important in photography and especially in estate planning, is that you should include people. Some people like taking landscape photos. I love that too, but it always makes it more interesting when there's a person involved, because we can identify much better with it. And in estate planning, I think it's important to include people, but those people should be professionals. With Ultima, you are very spoiled with very proficient financial and estate planners. And why I think they are very important to be part of the structure and your estate plan is that they know that you only have one chance of getting it right. If you've passed away, you've passed away. There's no way of rectifying that will if it wasn't done properly the first time. Sometimes you actually need more than a will. You need a plan. You need a plan as to how it will best benefit your family. How can we structure these assets to make sure that everyone gets the most benefit from it? Thirdly, they know how to be objective. They're not part of the family. They don't have specific issues or history in the family. So it's important that to give you clarity as well as to what you would like to achieve. They know how to save time, energy, and money. This is their day jobs. They are proficient in making estate plans. Obviously, they know the best ways to create certainty, to make sure that there's no unforeseen cost or additional cost which is unnecessary, and to save time. You don't have to spend the time to do research about all these principles. They are skilled and they know how to do it. They also know legalese. So the person who's going to, and legalese is basically just legal speak, all these big words, attorneys and lawyers or attorneys, lawyers, they use to explain certain things. But as an executor, many a time is also a person who understands legals or who manages these things. They will understand the wording and they will make sure that the wording is proper to make that it has the intended consequence. And then they also know that the only constant in life is change. Things will change, but they will move and change with the times. Lastly, the last thing is lock the focus. And I want to say, let's refocus. An estate plan is a brilliant thing, but it's not a once-in-a-lifetime type of exercise. An estate plan, I think, is a living document. It's something that should be reviewed on a regular basis, even if it is just to confirm that everything is in order. But when you relocate, many of our friends and our colleagues have decided to immigrate in the last few years. That's always a good plan then to revise your estate plan, as you have basically feet in two countries, and how the different jurisdictions legislation work is very important to make sure that your estate plan keeps up with that. When your objects of affection change, it's also good. If you get married, if you get remarried, if you get divorced, if your spouse would pass away, it's good to revise this plan, because you might not intend that a specific person should inherit, and if you did not revise your plan, that could still be the case. When your assets and liabilities change, sometimes people mention assets by the name in their wills, but then they would dispose of that asset and nobody could find that asset. So when you get the will, it speaks about a specific property, but that property is no longer in existence. So it's always a good idea to refocus when you change or dispose or acquire new assets. And then lastly, sometimes relationships change as well. The person who you trust with your estate planning, with your financial planning, the person who advises you, the person who helps you to implement these plans, they also change. And I think it's important to revise your plan also with regards to executives and trustees, that you want to make sure that the people you trust will be the people your family eventually trusts to take care of them. So to make sure that your photograph is focused and your estate plan is focused, review it at least, in my opinion, annually. Lastly, I want to say that Ansel Adams is a very famous American photographer. He said, you don't take a photograph, you make it. And I want to say that we don't take an estate plan. We don't just phone someone and say, please give me your estate plan and I can use it for my circumstances. You make it. You take in consideration your family composition, your assets, your liabilities, your picture, your way of doing things. And then you make sure that you make the best possible plan to address your needs and your family's needs. I thank you.
Thank you, Marie. Really appreciate it. Fantastic. I just have two questions that come in. The first is just a general question. Do you think Treasury will consider to increase the 3.5 million abatement that individuals receive currently with inflation?
I don't think they will. The Davis Commission, you might know that the Davis Commission was appointed to address the whole issue about estate duty and how they would manage it and so forth. A few years ago, I did a dissertation about estate duty and whether they would abolish it or how they would change it. And what I found in my research was that it's such a small part of the revenue. In the bigger scheme of things, estate duty is such a small part of that revenue that I think any way in which they can in more estate duty by, for instance, not increasing that 3.5 million abatement, they will use. So the estate duty is sort of also the last thing on their mind. There's bigger fish to fry, like all the VAT issues and capital gains tax, which is not enforced properly. So in my opinion, no, I can't see that they will change it soon. I might be wrong, but I can't see that they will change it soon.
Thank you, Marie. James says, thanks, excellent presentation. Charles has said, love the photography analogy. I'm really glad that we got your presentation up because the analogy with photography was really fantastic. The last was just also a practical question. You mentioned cryptocurrencies and passwords. So the question is, how should people then save these passwords?
It sounds funny, but old school. Old school in the sense that you should write it down and put it in a safe. I've heard of many people, because it's linked to that person, and then they don't communicate that password to the family, and eventually it's just lost. And there's no way you can recover those passwords. So the best way, I know even of people in life who's lost their passwords and lost the money, the funds completely. So the best way to save it is to save it old school. In my family, I made each family member, those hardband books with the tabs A, B, C, D, E, F. I bought them all a small book like that and gave it to them to write in the passwords. It's all kept in their safes, and then it's actually written in those little bookies. It sounds strange, but yeah, that's in my opinion the best way to do it.
Fabulous, thank you. Fred says thank you, very apt and informative. Thanks, Fred. Thanks for joining us. Yes, thank you, everyone, for joining us for this webinar. It was really informative. Thank you, Marie. We really appreciate your time. And we look forward then to our next event, which will be in 2021. So I hope you guys have a good week and a good few weeks coming up. Thank you so much for joining. This presentation and webinar will be made available on YouTube, on Ultima's YouTube channel in the next week or so. So just follow us on Facebook or follow us on our YouTube channel and you will get access to this as well. Thank you so much again. Take care. Goodbye.
Bye.